The Theosophical Society in America presents an interview with Mrs. Radha Burnier, International President of the Theosophical Society, conducted by Mrs. Dora Kunz, President of the Society's American Section.
My first question is, do you think that the Society has achieved the first object, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color?
I think the Society has achieved a great deal, but I do not agree with those people who think that we need to have fresh objects because this object has been fully achieved. Obviously, it is not. There are many people now, I believe particularly those who are well educated and who are professionals, scientists, psychologists, ecologists, anthropologists and so on, who realize that the world has to be considered as one entity. And thinking of the world in terms of fragments, whether those fragments are regional, political, or racial or anything else, only leads to intensified problems in the world. Obviously, problems like pollution, the ecological imbalances which are part of the present day world, all these are created by thinking in terms of fragments. So there are many people who have this holistic view, and I think this attitude has been very much influenced by Theosophy and the work that the Theosophical Society has done. And surely these people who are the thoughtful men and women of the world will be those who will lead the world into its real future. But at the same time, there are the vast masses of people who act like masses always do. They don't think about most questions. They are led by those who offer them satisfactions, by the politicians. And the politicians have a vested interest in keeping the world divided. And we find the world is divided. In many places, hatred, suspicion, and mutual fear is stimulated by interested parties, and so we find the world is broken into the east and the west, the north and the south. There are bitter wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, as in Ireland, between Muslims and Hindus on the Indian subcontinent. There is a tremendous chasm between the rich and the poor. There are people who enjoy extraordinary affluence while there are others who are in miserable poverty and degradation. And so we can't say that the Society has achieved its first object unless all these divisions are broken up and people really begin to share in every way. I think we have still to go on working for this.
How do you think a large or a study center can study this object or this subject of brotherhood?
I think obviously the individual lodge has to represent the Theosophical Society as a whole in its own locality, and it must be a center where people feel this sense of universality, and the studies and the discussions in the lodge should break down the sense of division in people. There are some who think that the nucleus of universal brotherhood, which is mentioned in the first object of the Society, implies that one must be brotherly with one's fellow members. But I think that's a very narrow interpretation. The nucleus must consist of people who have this forward-looking attitude, an attitude which will create a future in which there is the universal brotherhood of humanity, not just a comradeship between a certain group of people. And the Theosophical Society must be composed of persons who really feel the whole world is one, and who are willing to sacrifice their own interests for the sake of others. Madam Blavatsky said theosophy is altruism, and it ought to be that.
My second question is, what do you think are the implications of the third object of the society, which is to investigate the unexplained laws of nature, and what are the powers latent in man?
It is very important for man to understand the laws of nature. Of course, now he understands many of the physical laws because science has advanced so much. And before people understood the laws which are commonly known now, they were afraid of so many things. There were so many superstitions. You know, even natural phenomena provoked a feeling of fear. They felt that mysterious things were happening around them, and that they may be attacked by black forces or by magic. So they resorted to witch doctors and so on. Now, the laws of nature are exist at the invisible levels also, at the psychological levels. And human beings have done very little to understand the psychological laws, with the result that at that level they feel helpless, they feel rather afraid, they are superstitious. And I think the third object of the society implies the study of the universe as an expression of law at every level. If people understood the psychological laws, they wouldn't be afraid of the future, of death, of what might happen to them. There would be a possibility of taking their own lives into their hands and doing what is necessary to bring about happiness, peace, and those things which human beings really long for. Now, I think that it is important not only to understand the laws of nature, but to understand human nature. The third object of the society has been interpreted to mean the study of psychic phenomena. Of course, it is interesting and perhaps to some extent useful to study psychic phenomena, extrasensory perception and so on. I think a great deal of research has been done and is being done along these lines. But man is not a physical being, he is not a psychic being either. There are much greater depths in man. Essentially, he is a spiritual being. And to study the powers latent in man means understanding the constitution of man and realizing what is his essential nature, which is spiritual. And there are powers which belong to that spiritual area. I think love, for example, is part of the spiritual nature. Love is a great power. People think of power in terms of in materialistic terms, but I think one can think of power in spiritual terms. If there were love in the heart of man, the entire world would change. We spoke about altruism a little while ago. Well, altruism is not very different from love. Perhaps love is a deeper meaning term. So, investigating the powers latent in man means digging deep into one's own nature, understanding what are the depths in the human being, and discovering the spiritual qualities which are within. the quality of truth, of love, of wisdom, and so on. And if that were undertaken, which is a form of yoga, which is the real meaning of yoga, I think it could lead man to find all that is really valuable, and which could make the relationship of man with everything else, with his fellow human beings, with nature itself, a totally different relationship, a beneficial one, not a confused one.
What do you think the lodges can do? Particularly, you mentioned altruism. How can they do this study in the lodges or study centers?
I think they have to study the practical implications of theosophical concepts. I think every aspect of theosophy has a practical implication, but very often the study becomes theoretical, unrelated to one's psychological state, one's relationship with one's fellow human beings, and so on. But every concept has some relevance to daily life. And the HPB and various others have spoken about the importance of self-knowledge. I think that is also forgotten. Self-knowledge is very important. The Greeks spoke about it, and there was the famous maxim, man, know thyself. I think the lodges of the Theosophical Society should not forget the whole question of self-knowledge, or even the study of the book of nature. Nature is not only the trees and the plants and all that, but human nature is also nature, and it is important to study life itself. And I think all books are an aid to understand life. Books are not an end in themselves, they are a means to an end, which is the understanding of by man of himself, of nature, and of his relationship with nature.
What are some of the most important concepts in the theosophical teachings, from your point of view?
I think the most important concept is, of course, the concept of wholeness, which people are beginning to realize now, the unity of all existence. And if that concept is understood in its deepest sense, it leads to various other concepts inevitably. Even scientists now say that you cannot harm some part of the world without harming other parts. For a long time, people have realized that the world is interlinked, and that economically, politically, what happens in one part of the world has repercussions on other parts of the world and on other people. That is all true. But at a deeper level also, this is a fact, and that is what the Theosophical Society or Theosophical teaching stresses, the wholeness of existence. And I think following that is the concept of responsibility. The Dalai Lama, when he spoke here in Wheaton some time back, made a very striking statement, which is very similar to the statement which Krishnaji very often makes. He said that you are responsible for the whole world. It seems a rather sweeping statement, but I think it is a very important one, and Theosophical teaching stresses this individual responsibility. It is implied in the whole law of karma or of harmony. I think karma is not something to be studied as an abstract theory, but as something which has a practical relevance, which we mentioned. If one understands karma, one becomes a responsible human being. It means that whatever we think and we do, what we speak, all that has a consequence which may be immediate or it may be delayed, but it has a consequence. And all of us are either doing something which helps the world, or we are adding to the confusion and problems of the world by the way in which we think and act. I think Theosophical teaching stresses this very much. And if we are responsible, then we can either create a future which is a future moving towards perfection, towards progress, or a future which keeps humanity where it is or puts it one step back. Each one of us has a part to play in creating that future. The future does not come by itself. There is no such thing as chance or determinism. And so this is a very important principle of theosophy. In the present day, there are a lot of so-called gurus. I think there are a lot of bogus teachers who are giving an impression that the individual does not have to try to live intelligently to find out what life is all about, how it has to be lived, and so on. They create the superstition that following the guru or repeating a few things he says is all that is necessary. In other words, a state of blind obedience, blind living, and acceptance of somebody else's ideas, thoughts, the casting of responsibility on somebody else. Now, Theosophical teaching, I think, completely contradicts that. Responsibility cannot be put on somebody else, either for what goes wrong or for what brings one to the good. So one can't throw the responsibility on some teacher, some authority, some so-called master. In the Theosophical Society, I think the spirit of self-reliance has always been emphasized. Each one has to be the master of his own life and of his future. Of course, there are people who can help. There are various things which can help. This does not mean that one does not accept the benefit of other people's intelligence or their maturity or experience. But as has been said so many times, a teacher can point out the way, but he can't tread the path for another. And this has been the attitude which has been emphasized in the society. Therefore, the General Council of the society has passed a resolution to say that there is no authority in the society. Nobody's words are the ultimate authority about truth. And I think that is very important in understanding, because if there is an authority and we merely accept what that authority says and repeat it, then it is not truth. It is a rejection of intelligence. If through using one's intelligence, through one's own exploration, meditation, study, one discovers something for oneself, one has assimilated the truth of something, then it is really truth. But if one is repeating, then it is just a dogma or tenet. And in the Theosophical Society, there are no dogmas, no beliefs which are to be repeated. I think this is fundamental to the society. Don't you think so?
Yes, I think it's very important that each person can only grow by his own choices, which is putting it a different way from yours, because the only way to grow is to constantly be able to make choices and not to throw the responsibility of that on a guru's or anybody else's shoulders.
Yes, or even on books. If we repeat what is written in books, whether they are by Madame Blavatsky or Annie Besant or anybody else, we are only repeating. Perhaps we can put the whole thing in another way, that the evolutionary process is an awakening of intelligence. You know, it has been said so often that as forms evolve through the evolutionary process, consciousness unfolds itself. Now, consciousness is intelligence, which means intelligence must blossom. Now, intelligence does not unfold when a person is blindly obeying or repeating. It takes place only when he looks into things for himself. He studies, he observes, he listens, he thinks, and finds out for himself. What he finds out may be what is said in the ancient books, in the theosophical books, but he finds it out for himself. I think this is very important. Then it becomes real.
I think what you said, Radha, is very interesting. But the members often misinterpret the idea of mind because of what HPB says, mind is the slayer of the real. And I think your statements clarify this because there is an intelligence greater than the mind.
Yes, it can be misinterpreted. Of course, the personal mind slays the real. Well, I think one has to make a distinction between the personal mind and the mind which is widening into a state of universality. In ancient India, they made this distinction between the pure mind and the impure mind. The impure mind is the mind which is full of personal desires and ambitions, and when such desires exist, then it acts as a screen which prevents the perception of the real. But when those personal ambitions disappear or gradually they are wiped away and the mind is lifted to a different level, with universal level, then the mind becomes an instrument which begins to reflect the truth. And I think real intellect or intelligence is different from this kind of a personal mind. And I think one of the things that the study of theosophical teachings has to do is to make the mind awake to universal questions, to consider problems from an impersonal point of view. You know, every problem can be considered from 2 points of view. There is the pervading problem of suffering. Most people ignore the suffering of the world, but they give tremendous importance to any suffering which comes to themselves. Now, the same problem of suffering can be looked at from an impersonal, universal point of view. And I think when the mind becomes wider, breaks down its boundaries, then it's a very good instrument. And I think when you speak about intelligence, you mean that different quality of mind.
We thank Radha for being willing to answer these questions, which should be of great interest to our lodges and members, because these videotapes, if they are successful, will be sent out to the lodges, and individual members can also borrow them. Thank you, Radha.